right, well, everybody, good morning. It is 7:44, so even though I know we're missing some people, I am going to get started talking about the Reign of Terror. So let me set this up real quickly here. All right. So, where we left off last time, talking about the Reign of Terror, I told you about this organization known as the Committee of Public Safety. And this was the emergency government that was formed by Maximilien Robespierre to deal with both internal and external challenges to the revolution. Remember, by this point, France is involved in a war with an entire coalition of nations, including Britain, the Dutch Republic, Austria, Prussia, and so on. Each of them interested in ending the French Revolution, of course, because the revolution itself poses a threat to their nations if it started to spread across the countryside, outside the boundaries of France and into other places. So this could have really ultimately led to a widespread European revolt in the name of Enlightenment principles, right? Liberalism, freedom, equality, getting rid of the old regime, getting rid of kings, instituting republics, all of those sorts of things. Because it was considered so radical, the other nations have a vested interest in preserving the status quo, and they declare war against France. Of course, internally, France also has several struggles, most of them economic in nature, but also too kind of widespread chaos during the early part of the Reign of Terror, shortly after the September massacres and so on. They need to do something to restore some semblance of order. And so the Committee of Public Safety is organized in order to help with continuing this radical phase of the French Revolution. And here you have Maximilien Robespierre. And I wanted to take a minute. So many of you are, you guys are STEM kids. You guys are all STEM kids. And as a result of that, it may be the case that some of you, history may not be like your number one favorite thing. Maybe you're more interested in math or science, or whatever, medicine, computer engineering, you name it. And but there are ways in which these fields, these disciplines, have some common ground. And so I wanted to take a minute to show you. I'm just going to pull this up really quickly. There's a particular field of forensic sciences that is closely associated with history. And back in the day, they used to take molds of people's faces when they died. And this is a cool area of forensic science where they've basically taken old, what they call death masks, where they take these plaster molds of these people's faces. And using computer technology, they do a 3D scan of it, and they do a reconstruction of the person's face. And so if we wonder what Maximilien Robespierre looks like, this is the painting. This is, in all reality, probably very, very close to what he looked like in real life. Now, you might notice that he's got some pockmark scars on his face, which would have been a common thing for Europeans during this time who suffered through smallpox as a child. It would leave their faces horribly scarred with these pockmark indentations on their face. And so I just wanted to take a minute to show this to you, because sometimes it's kind of, we don't have photography at this point in history. Photography doesn't really come around until the 1830s. And so there have been a number, you can look this up on your own. There have been a number of different historical figures throughout time, some of them a very, very long time ago, where they're using skeletal remains, and then others of them more recently where they're using death masks, which are probably a little bit more accurate in terms of getting the likeness of the person. But yeah, this is a neat area in which, if you ever wanted to get into forensic sciences, this is kind of a burgeoning field of basically reconstructing historical figures to be anatomically accurate. And here we have also, there's another one that they did that we talked about earlier, Richard III of England, reconstruction, images. Here you can see they did it with Richard III. So they took and they did a historical forensic model of, in all likelihood, what Richard III looked like. Richard III, if you guys don't remember the story about him, he was the one who, his two nephews, his older brother was king before him, and his two nephews were the ones, were like, I don't know, maybe 9 and 12 years old or something like that. And one day they just go missing. And they found them centuries later. They found 2 skeletal remains of these boys underneath a staircase, I think in the Tower of London, if I remember right. And it's in all likelihood, Richard III had his nephews killed so that he could become king. But ultimately, Richard III was killed in the Battle of Bosworth Field in 1485. And that was what ended the Plantagenet dynasty and started the Tudor dynasty. So, anyhow, that just kind of gives you a little bit of an idea of how sometimes even in seemingly unconnected things like, let's say, STEM and European history, there is some boundary where those two things meet, and it's kind of a cool thing. And hey, maybe it interests you, or maybe you're into like forensic sciences or anything like that, becoming a forensics investigator one day. This would be another viable avenue of research to go down. Anyway, I just thought I would share that with you. So we finished up last time talking about the law of maximum, a planned economy to respond to food shortages and related to economic problems. What this law of maximum would do is it would enable France to basically wage total war against its enemies. It's a predecessor to the concept of total war that takes place in World War I. And so what is this? Usually in times of peace, particularly in democratic states, in times of peace, private companies are able to more or less kind of just handle their own affairs, do what they want to do, make the things where there's demands, make money, and so on and so forth. In situations of war, particularly real devastating wars like World War I and like the French Revolutionary Wars, the government needs the assistance of everyone, including non-military people, just regular citizens, workers, and so on, to perpetuate the war effort. And so when we think about total war, what we're talking about is the government essentially cracking down on various aspects of the economy and taking direct control over production, wages, prices, and so on. And the reason that they do this is, let's say in a modern time, this is not the case in the French Revolution because we're still in a pre-industrial revolution time in the French Revolution, right? The French Revolution happens in the late 1700s, but that's really before industrialization has gotten fully underway, and it doesn't even start first in France. It starts first in England. And so France is a little behind in all honesty due to the French Revolution and then the entire period of Napoleon. France does not, during that period of time where England is kind of beginning this transition into a more industrial economy, France lags behind a bit due to these various revolutions going on, as well as the rise of Napoleon. And so the government during this time doesn't have as many private industries as we do today in the United States. But just to give you an example, in a context of World War I, because it's a little bit easier to explain how total war works with a little more modern example. So in World War I, let's say there were a bunch of like shoe companies, right? Like whatever, Nike, Adidas, whatever. And in a total war situation, what could happen is that the government essentially goes to these private companies, let's say Nike, and says, okay, Nike, you make shoes. You're now no longer making shoes. You're going to be making military boots for the troops, right? And it's like, they pay them, there's a government contract involved, the company remains private in name, but they're being forced essentially by the government to produce goods for the wartime effort. This happens in other areas too. Let's say like, Ford, right? Maybe the government goes to Ford and they're like, we want you to designate, 25% of your production to whatever, armored vehicles or something like that. And so the government essentially steps in and starts regulating the economy from a top-down perspective. Now, of course, the law of maximum in the French Revolution didn't, happen at a time where the French government had all these, huge private corporations to draw upon. But nonetheless, what it does do is it does undermine the principles of economic liberalism that the bourgeoisie otherwise would have stood for, right? This is decidedly not very liberal because the government is stepping in and taking control of the economy for the purposes of, number one, war, right? Because they're fighting against all of these different nations. But then number two, also, for the purpose of control, because the French economy was in such a dire condition, they didn't want the situation getting worse while they were also fighting these foreign wars. So the government decreed maximum allowable prices. They fixed in paper assignats. The prices were fixed in those paper assignats, those currency, the French currency that I told you about that was enacted during the French Revolution for certain products, namely like bread and stuff. So they fixed the price of bread at a level that the poor could afford. And, that should say the rationing of bread was introduced. Rationing is when you take and you only allow a certain amount of a product to be purchased at any given time. We've seen a little bit of rationing happen in private companies during the pandemic this last year, right? So sometimes you'd go to Costco or the grocery store or whatever, and they'll say maximum number per, limit one per customer or something like that. That's a form of rationing so that more people are able to purchase the goods rather than having somebody come in there and purchase all of them and start hoarding them or reselling them for a higher value. The store will ultimately end up limiting you from being able to purchase as many as you want. So the government ended up nationalizing many small workshops. In other words, small workshops in and around Paris got taken over by the government, and they started requisitioning raw materials and grain from peasants who had to help on their end in the countryside by supplying the raw materials for the purposes of production. So these small workshops start producing arms and munitions for the war effort, and basically it's an early version of socialism or of a command economy. We'll see the same kinds of principles taken to an entirely new level during the Russian Revolution, which happens in 1917. Slavery during the French Revolution in the Reign of Terror is abolished in the French Empire, namely the biggest slave colony in the Caribbean that the French held was called Saint-Domingue at the time. Today it's now known as Haiti. There was a freed slave by the name of Toussaint Louverture who led probably really the most revolutionary revolution of the 1700s in Haiti. And the reason it would be considered the most revolutionary is because we're talking about a truly, like, the most oppressed group of people, which was African descent slaves in Haiti, who managed to overthrow the French dominion over the colony of Saint-Domingue, and they established a free republic, and Napoleon tried to reinstate slavery in Saint-Domingue, but they rejected that as well and emerged victorious again. And so Haiti is really kind of conceived of in very interesting historical terms. Okay, so the military victory. Lazare Carnot reorganized the French army as the war was going on, utilizing what was known as levee en masse. The entire nation gets conscripted into service as the war was defined as a national mission. So this is a French Revolutionary War. It's for the entire French people. And as such, because they are fighting for their national identity and for the future of their nation, they conscript or draft the entire population into the French military. So the size of the army grew substantially to 1 million men, which had been unprecedented in the history of European warfare. So they have just a massive, massive army now. By July of 1794, the Austrian Netherlands, Belgium in other words, which borders France just to the east, and the Rhineland, which is a place that is the borderlands between France and Germany, were once again started to be controlled by the French. And the planned economy that they were utilizing by, the law of maximum made this mobilization effort of their troops very effective. Of course, nationalism, the idea of the French citizen being loyal to the state, became a very strong uniting force for the French people, who increasingly saw themselves on the same side rather than divided by the estate system as they had been for so many centuries before. And these victories ultimately led to a relaxation of emergency controls, but the reign of terror continued and extended onwards. So the reign of terror is really this period of time from 1793 to 4, which is the most notorious phase of the French Revolution, during the years where Maximilien Robespierre and the National Convention and Committee of Public Safety are in charge. One of the most famous laws that came out of the Reign of Terror was known as the Law of Suspects, which is where alleged enemies of the revolution would be brought before these revolutionary tribunals that were created to hear cases of treason. In other words, people going against the state. That's what treason is. And in this case, they had a very loose definition of treason, because treason, usually you have to do something that's deliberately like undermining or sabotaging the government in order to be, accused of treasonous activity. During the French Revolution, though, you know, even just not being excited enough about the revolution was enough to draw suspicion upon yourself for being an anti-revolutionary. And this was the danger, is that these military tribunals really don't practice the kinds of public, what's the word that I'm looking for? They don't practice the kinds of like regulations or you know, due process of law that our modern government does here in America, for example, right? So here in America, the law works in a very known, orderly way, and it works the same for everyone. If you're accused of a crime, they will read you your Miranda rights. You have the right to remain silent. Everything you say can and will be used against you. They, you know, bring you to the police. They arrest you. They bring you to the police station. They tell you what your charges are. And then you have a hearing with a judge who sets a court date, and you can then at that time bail yourself out, and so on and so forth. There's this whole process of things. And then even right down to the courtroom, like when your trial takes place, there's all of these very rigid, formulaic regulations that are used to make sure that the law is administered the same for everyone. This is not the case during the time of the law of suspects, where these tribunals that they held for people were really a travesty in many cases, where there was literally no evidence, and based purely on you know, how bloodthirsty they were that day, you could be sentenced to death and executed that afternoon. Very scary time, lots of fear, lots of terror. And so, you know, this is one of those situations where a whole lot of folks ended up being wrongly accused and losing their lives over it. So this was instituted as an alternative to the lynch law of the September massacres, and here you can see this political cartoon illustrates the law of suspects as Robespierre searches for potential enemies of the revolution. And here you can see Queen Marie Antoinette, who was executed in October of 1793, so about 10 months after her husband passed. Poor Marie Antoinette, you know, I think that she kind of gets a bad shake in history. You know, the poor lady couldn't have helped that she was born into royalty. She couldn't have helped that she was married off to Louis XVI. She couldn't have helped that she had no ability to perceive of the experiences of the common people. She was very much just a product of her time, and she becomes a victim of the revolution in the sense that they really drag her name over the mud. They slander her. It's an early demonstration of how you can really just completely destroy a person's public image, and that image can stick with them for a long time, even to this day. You know, people tend to look back at Marie Antoinette, and we know all of the stories about how she was nicknamed Madame Deficit and all this stuff. And she's seen as out of touch, and she's seen as unsympathetic to the peasants and so on. In reality, she's just a person, and you know, and she's just a human being, and she's a human being that was wrapped up completely in her historical context. And you know, they do all sorts of terrible things. They accused her of incest with her son, which was abjectly false. They bring her out in her execution. They bring her out on a common criminal's cart rather than Louis XVI, who got brought out in a coach or a carriage and was protected from the booing and the spitting and the throwing of rotten fruit and other things like that. Marie Antoinette's brought out on a common criminal's cart, the same as somebody who robbed a store or anyone else who was against the revolution. Remember that one of the ideas about the guillotine was that everybody was to be common in death, that the guillotine was unusually used as a symbol of equality by the French revolutionary government of the National Convention and Maximilien Robespierre. And so when they bring her out on a common criminals cart, they are essentially sending the message to the French population that this person is no better than anyone else. In fact, she's worse because she used to have the ability to do something about this, and she refused. And so, I have to say that I kind of take a little bit of an apologetic or sympathetic approach to Queen Marie Antoinette because I think that she got really poorly treated towards the end of her life, unfairly treated in many respects. And we can say as much as we want about her failures in terms of leadership prior to the start of the revolution. But at the same time, does that mean that she should have been treated so badly? And I don't necessarily think that that's the case. So here's Queen Marie Antoinette. About 40,000 people were executed or died in prison throughout France during this period of time. Many, of course, dying at the hands of the guillotine. And executions became a spectator sport. During the French Revolution, one of the things that's really interesting about it is that, there's this carnage. There's all of this really grotesque carnage. And people are coming out in droves, daily, multiple times a week, let's say, or at least several times a month to watch public executions, to watch people get their heads chopped off in a public forum. And that's a pretty, when you really think about that, I think it's revealing of just how brutal the society was at the time. It certainly doesn't, here we are, there's a certain irony there, right? Because you think about how the revolution is being waged for the cause of reason, right? For the cause of enlightenment, for the cause of freedom, for the cause, and I'd say freedom of speech, freedom of religion, right? Freedom of press. And seemingly, while they are on the surface trying to implement all of these things, right? People are participating in some of the most savage behaviors one could imagine, right? So there's a certain irony to the French Revolution because you have these people who are just bloodthirsty, and you have a government that is trying to institute a republic while at the same time using fear, terror, and oppression to maintain control and law and order. And so the Reign of Terror is a really unusual, radical time. And so terror very much became a weapon, not aimed at any class in particular, just broadly across the entire French population. In terms of the number of people who were killed, 8% were nobles, 14% were from the bourgeoisie, 6% were clergy, and 70%, of course, were peasants and workers because they made up the majority of the population. And sure, some peasants and workers could be conservative, but for the most part, the thing is that it seemingly the revolution was meant to help the Third Estate, while at the same time it is preying on a considerable number of people from the Third Estate, right? Which is unusual. Why would they? You would think that most of the carnage would have been taken out on nobles and clergy, former First and Second Estate members, but it wasn't. The majority of it was taken out on the Third Estate. And sure, some Third Estate people weren't in favor of the National Convention, but surely many were, or at least many who lost their lives were. So most deaths occurred in places that were in open revolt against the National Convention, such as the Vendée in western France. There was a situation in the Vendée where basically, and they talk about it briefly in that documentary, they basically sink a ship and kill everybody on board. And then there's other ones where they're just mowing people down with cannon fire. It's pretty brutal. And then you had another 300,000 who were imprisoned. So here you have the National Razor, and it's this really ominous looking device, a large slanted blade that comes forcefully down onto the back of the neck, and this was this was the common method of execution. Interesting fact for you about the guillotine is that the last execution by guillotine in France happened, I believe, in like the 1970s, right? Which is pretty amazing if you think about it, because it seems like such a brutal device. But oddly, this might seem weird to you, but believe it or not, they actually thought that the guillotine was the most humane way of executing somebody. And so that's the thing that's so weird about it, is to us in our modern day context, watching somebody, it's even if I had the opportunity to watch somebody be beheaded by way of a guillotine, I have no interest in watching that. It's grim, it's gruesome. I don't want to see that. I don't want to be traumatized by it, like it's horrible. But oddly, people were like fine with it precisely because they believed that it was the most humane way to have the state take someone's life. And again, that itself undermines the principles of César Beccaria in the Enlightenment, who said that the state shouldn't be executing anyone, who was, stalwartly opposed to using capital punishment as a means of a sentence against a criminal. So this is a quote. It says, "It is dreadful but necessary." Anonymous print from the journal of Austrian Monde of 1794. Eventually, of course, that quote is referring to the use of the guillotine. Eventually, leading Jacobins who opposed Robespierre start to be executed, including the Girondists in September of 1793. There was a guy by the name of Jacques Hébert, Jacques Hébert, and he was a radical Democrat who led what were known as the Angry Men, or the Hébertistes, the Hébertistes, followers of Hébert. And this was a party of extreme terror that was essentially challenging Maximilien Robespierre. But the leaders were found out and executed in March of 1794, and ultimately the Paris Commune was completely destroyed. Georges Danton and his followers, because Danton and Maximilien Robespierre had a split. They used to be very close friends. They both sat at the very top of the chamber hall, the assembly hall that the National Convention met in as part of the Mountain. But when Georges Danton suggested that perhaps it was time to bring the terror to an end, Maximilien Robespierre turns on him and says, "How dare you?" and accuses him of being anti-revolutionary, which is of course ridiculous, because Georges Danton had been a radical supporter of the revolution from the very start. Georges Danton was kind of this gregarious, loudmouth, but likable guy, whereas Maximilien Robespierre was kind of an introverted, very controlled, disciplined, guy. They're both brilliant orators. They're both very capable of giving a speech. But in terms of just pure personality, Danton was certainly the more sociable one, the one that was more easy to get along with than Robespierre. And they forbid George Danton from speaking at his trial where he's accused of being anti-revolutionary, in part because they're convinced, Robespierre is convinced that if they let George Danton speak, he's going to be persuasive. He doesn't want to allow George Danton to turn people away from Robespierre. And so they don't allow him to speak. And as Danton was led to his execution, he predicted that Robespierre would be dead within 3 months. And so this is when, after George Danton is executed, Maximilien Robespierre really just goes straight up cuckoo for Cocoa Puffs, if you catch my drift. He decides to institute something known as the Republic of Virtue, where he emerges, with this, so he comes out with this idea to try to completely radically change the culture of France to promote revolutionary virtue. Okay, and that word virtue should ring a bell in your head because it's something that we talked about when we were looking at the Renaissance. Okay, the Renaissance was talking about virtue and this idea of becoming educated and embracing a Renaissance, a Renaissance education and so on and so forth. So Maximilien Robespierre outlaws the Catholic Church. The cult of supreme being was introduced in June of 1794. This is just about not that long before Maximilien Robespierre gets executed himself. Deistic natural religion. Basically, they try to convert the French state, the entire country of France, over to deism, which was, remember, the religious arm of the Enlightenment, where people believed in a creator but weren't really Christian. They believed in the laws of the universe that governed all things, right? So the Republic recognized the existence of God and the immortality of the soul, but Notre Dame, previously a Catholic cathedral, temporarily got converted into what was called the Temple of Reason. He's trying to get people to worship reason and the principles of the Enlightenment in the same way that they would their religion. He also created a revolutionary calendar, which got rid of the 7-day week and created 10-day weeks with new months and all of these things. And this got instituted in late 1793, and in fact, it lasted all the way up until 1805. Again, the idea being, if you make the calendar a 10-day week, people will eventually forget what day Sunday was. And, so this would cut down on church attendance and hopefully get people to stop worshiping and embrace this new idea of this Republic of Virtue, where you have the cult of the supreme being, where people would be worshiping, the goddess of reason. All right. Here is actually a pocket watch from the French Revolutionary calendar, what they call the French Republican calendar. And you can see the different months that they have here and so on. Okay, end of the terror. So opposition to Robespierre begins to mount in July of 1794. He gets completely denounced in the National Convention. He is arrested and executed the next day. And the way that this basically goes down is that Maximilien Robespierre shows up about 2 months or so after George Danton's death. And he says, if George Danton, our dear friend George Danton, can be persuaded to turn against the revolution, that means anyone could be persuaded to turn against the revolution. I have a list of names that I've compiled who I suspect to be sympathizers of George Danton, but I'm not going to tell you who's on the list. And when he makes this announcement to the National Convention, of course, if you're sitting in that room and you hear Maximilien Robespierre give this speech about how he's compiled a list of people that he suspects to be against the revolution, of course, the first thing that's going to go through your mind is, I wonder if I'm on that list. And so the people just immediately freaked out. They're like, we can't, this guy's a lunatic. And so we can't continue to let him run the show. So many people were fearing that they would be executed, and working class radicals no longer had supported him after the death of Hébert, who had challenged the rule of Maximilien Robespierre. And so Maximilien Robespierre is put to death himself. And so many executions. You know, we've talked about Louis XVI, Marie Antoinette, George Danton, now Maximilien Robespierre, and then countless others throughout this period of time. So this is sometimes what is called the Thermidorian reaction, because it happened in the Revolutionary Republican calendar month of Thermidor. Remember, they don't call it July, they called it Thermidor. They renamed the calendar, remember. But the Thermidorian reaction ended the terror of 1794, and this constituted a significant swing to the right, conservatism. This is ending the most radical phase. People were tired of the terror. They just were tired of constantly living in perpetual fear for their lives. And so after the Thermidorian reaction, we see the revolution, the spirit of the revolution, swing back the other direction to being much more conservative and less radical. Okay? Respectable bourgeois lawyers and professionals who led the liberal revolution of 1789 were the ones that started to take control back from the government. You know, the ones who had been writing the Declaration of the Rights of Man and Citizen and things like that. Okay? They reduced the powers of the Committee of Public Safety, and they completely closed down the Jacobin Club, which had essentially been in charge of one-party rule for about 2 or 3 years now. And the Girondins was readmitted into the government because they too found themselves victims of the mountain, of the Committee of Public Safety. So, after the fall of the Reign of Terror, we see a new government, brand new government, once again, okay? So now we've been through the National Assembly, the Legislative Assembly, the National Convention, and now we're on our 4th iteration of government in 6 years, and this one's known as the Directory. This one lasts a little bit longer. It lasts from 1795 to 1799. And a new constitution was written in 1795, which set up a republican form of government. So we are still having a republic, that we're still in the age of Rousseau, okay? But it's going to be a much more conservative one, all right? We're not going to see the kind of bloodshed and chaos and terror anymore that we have been seeing in the last couple of classes. The Directory was a 5-member executive. In other words, think of it like having 5 presidents, each with the same amount of power, okay? They also instituted, instead of as they had before under the Legislative Assembly and under the National Convention, that was basically just a single house legislature. With the Directory, they create a bicameral legislature, a 2-house legislature, similar to ours, similar to Britain's. And most adult males could vote, but only for electors. They couldn't actually vote for, like the people themselves, I guess, if that makes any sense. Okay. Office holding was reserved for property owners. You could not hold office if you did not own property. All right. And the Directory is a much more conservative government, but the Directory is gonna, I just think about it for a second. The thing that makes the directory kind of weak in it's almost a little too cautious in a way. The reason that they made it so that you had a 5-member executive, where they basically had 5 presidents, is so that no one man would be in charge. But basically, in order to get laws passed, all of those people who were serving in the capacity on the top of the directory had to be in agreement of the law that was going into place. And this is going to make it difficult for laws to get passed in France because of kind of the just the system, the blueprint for this system that they have created is not one that is going to be super strong. The middle class, the bourgeoisie, is really the segment of the society that controlled the directory. But this became the directory's major weakness because its support came from such a narrow band of people in French society. The directory basically operated, was operated by and on behalf of the bourgeoisie, which only made up like 8 to 10% of French society, right? Most people are peasants or urban workers or whatever. And so the revolutionary government was not really helpful, the directory at least, was not very helpful to your common man in France. All economic controls were removed, which ended the influence of the sans-culottes. So the sans-culottes kind of like, their days were done. And the directory in 1795 also disbanded women's workshops and started urging women to tend to their homes. So there was this, another conservative part of this was kind of a social history aspect where they wanted women, to return to kind of this cult of domesticity where they would be in the home, working in the home, tending their families, doing those kinds of things rather than working in, they're in capacities that were deemed traditionally male roles. Challenges to the directory. So in October of 1795, you still had a good number of nobles from France living there who basically the nobles bound themselves together and or banded together, maybe is a better word. They didn't literally bind themselves together, but they united with one another, and they attempted a coup of the directory. So there was this royalist coup, okay? People who were loyal to the king, even though he was dead, but people who wanted to bring back the old regime and make France aristocratic again, if you will. Okay, these people attempted to overthrow the government in 1795, and the reason for this was it was a reaction, basically. I don't know why this is worded so funny, but this was a total reaction by the nobles to the bourgeoisie who had attempted to further consolidate their power. So in October of 1795, the bourgeoisie is the one that is in charge of the directory. They were trying to consolidate their power, and the nobles that remained in France and were loyal to the king basically reacted against this, and they said, we're not going to allow you to consolidate your power. However, what the nobles did not realize is that the person who would be in charge of leading the defense of the bourgeois-led directory would be none other than Napoleon Bonaparte. And so Napoleon Bonaparte, to give you a little bit of background on Napoleon, because it's the first time that he's really come up in our class, Napoleon is a guy who came from the small island of Corsica, which is in the Mediterranean Sea. Now, at the time that Napoleon was born, and I believe he was born right around 1769, somewhere in that area, okay, right around the time that Napoleon was born, Corsica was controlled by France at that time. It was considered a French territory. but he's not a traditional Frenchman. He's kind of a little bit of an outsider in an unusual way. Napoleon was a noble. He was part of the second estate, but he was a lesser noble. He wasn't a really well-connected noble. He lived in Corsica, which was a million miles, as far as anyone was concerned at that time, a million miles away from Paris. So he's not one of these like old school, corrupt nobles that had been living at Versailles and stuff like that. He's kind of an outsider. And he joins, as happens a lot of times with noble children, they go into military academies. So he is sent to military school at age 9, and he becomes a lieutenant in the artillery, which is, so your military, just to give you a little bit of like military history here, your military is made up of several different parts. You have your cavalry, which is like horseback. You've got your infantry. These are like soldiers who march on the front lines into battle. You have artillery, which is cannon fire. That's what Napoleon was in, like ranged fire, ranged attack. And so Napoleon was an artillery expert. And then, of course, you have other segments of the military, like the Navy and so on and so forth. But Napoleon was a lieutenant, which means he was an officer in the artillery by the time that he hits age 16. And when the French Revolution breaks out in 1789, he's about 20 years old. So he's still a pretty young man when the French Revolution breaks out. But the French Revolution breaks out in 1789, and he doesn't really start to make a name for himself until he is put in charge of the defense of the Revolutionary Directory government. And that's in 1795. So by that point, he's about 26 years old, okay? And 25, 26. And so Napoleon, the famous quote from Napoleon is that he was able to put down this royalist noble attempted coup with what he called a whiff of grape shot. What is a whiff of grape shot? Well, as this noble revolt attempted to overthrow the Directory, he basically, so you know cannons, I told you he was an artillery guy. You can load up different kinds of ammunition into cannons. And I don't know if you know how anything about like guns or anything like wartime weapons, but a shotgun, for example, okay, you can put most often when you load a cartridge into a shotgun, it's a round that it's filled with a bunch of small pellets. It's a giant round that's filled with a bunch of small metal BB looking pellets. And they have different sizes of them, buckshot, bird shot, etc. And when you shoot a shotgun, the pellets spread out, okay, and do a tremendous amount of damage. But you could also, in a shotgun, you can put what's called a slug in it, which is just a single solid metal round. And that is more of an impact force, right? Well, with a cannon, traditionally you think of a cannonball being loaded into a cannon, but they have something called grape shot. And what grape shot is it's basically a bunch of grape-sized metal pellets that are loaded into a cannon and fired at a target. In this case, this angry mob of nobles that was attempting to overthrow the Directory. So he literally takes it like a cannon and fires into this crowd, and the crowd, of course, disperses because it's like they're gonna die, and so he successfully leads this revolt. in case you're wondering, like, what would they usually use grape shot for? Grape shot was often used in naval battles because if you fire a cannonball at a sail, at the sails of a ship, it'll put a hole through all of the sails, but that's just one hole. The sail will mostly still remain intact, and the ship will be able to continue to sail. You know, just because the sails are massive, if it has a 5-inch hole in it, it's not going to make a difference, really. But if you fire grape shot at a sail, it will completely tear it to pieces, and it will render the ship immobile. So that's actually the most common use of grape shot, not firing it into crowds. But anyhow, so here you can see a painting of Napoleon. And there's his quote with a whiff of grape shot. Napoleon's victories afterwards, after 1795, after Napoleon led this defense of the Directory, he is sent to lead the French troops in a long campaign across Europe against Austria. And so Napoleon and his army end up marching all the way across the Alps, all the way down, like past the Mediterranean Sea, and they end up in Egypt. And it's not until 1790, like the very end of 1798-99, that Napoleon gets pinned down in Egypt by the British Royal Navy under the leadership of a guy by the name of Horatio Nelson, who was this young, hotshot vice admiral in the British Navy at the time. And so the British Navy effectively was able to kind of pin Napoleon down in Egypt, where he eventually ends up, having to prevent the stories of his. So there was a famous battle at the end of 1798 called the Battle of the Nile, meaning the Nile River, and that was a battle that Napoleon lost. He lost this battle to the British, but because it happens in Egypt and he's so far away, and it was more of a naval thing than it was a battlefield battle, he kind of is able to prevent that story from getting back to the press in France. And so when he returns to France, he's very much hailed as a hero of the revolution and of the state, because he had just led this massive successful campaign against Austria. Okay, during the years, so we'll get back to Napoleon in a little bit here, but for right now, Napoleon is off fighting some battles in the Alps. Okay, let's get back to what else is going on in France or in Paris during this time. So the conspiracy of equals, led by Gracchus, as he called himself, Babeuf, which was a reference back to ancient times, ancient Roman Julius Caesar times. Formed to overthrow the Directory and replace it with a dictatorial democratic government. How can it be democratic if it's dictatorial? That doesn't make any sense. That's an oxymoron. But anyhow, this is Babeuf's solution, is to overthrow the Directory and replace it with a dictatorial democratic government which would abolish private property and enforce equality. Think of it almost like a very, very early form of communism, because that's a very communistic thing when the government is taking over all private property and redistributing everything equally. That's basically communism, right? So the Directory repressed the conspiracy of equals without any difficulty and guillotined Babeuf, who went down kind of ignominiously in history. All right, growing inflation and mass public dissatisfaction mounted during this time. People realized that the Directory was really pretty self-interested. They didn't have a whole lot of vested interest in helping anyone outside of their kind of crew of people within the bourgeoisie. And this dissatisfaction is ignored by the Directory, which makes people hate it even more. There were these elections in April of 1797 that resulted in a victory for royalists, conservatives who wanted to bring back absolutism. But basically, the Directory steps in and they're like, no, we're not giving control of the government back over to royalists. So it's like, you hold an election and the election comes out in a certain way, and then just because the government, didn't like it, they just overturn the results of the election, right? And so they get rid of the election results and they say, no, we're not going to have that happen. And frankly, we nearly just had that happen again with the Capitol riot. It was kind of a freaky situation there for a little bit there, but fortunately it didn't get any worse. But the election, the will of the people was spoken, and then all of these lies to try to convince people that somehow the election was rigged or something like that started spreading around, and a lot of people went for it. A lot of people believed it, believed what the government was telling them about it, and so anyhow, fortunately, democracy prevailed, and we had a peaceful transition of power. So you can see why people didn't like the Directory. They are not super attentive to the problems of the vast majority of the population, and they're also pretty corrupt. And so the Directory is by no means a perfect government. Even though we're not in a reign of terror anymore, there are other problems surfacing here with the Directory, and that's important to understand. Basically, a dictatorship was favorable to the revolution was established, what they call the post-Fructidorian terror. They do have a number of military successes thanks to Napoleon during this time, and that's really the main thing that allowed it to maintain its power until 1799, was that it had control of the military, and the military was very successful during the battles that occurred while the Directory was in power. And the first coalition ends up being defeated by 1797. England, though, still used their navy to try to thwart, Napoleon's victories. And Napoleon is defeated by the British Royal Navy in 1799 at the Battle of the Nile. So that was the thing where he got pinned down there. Napoleon defeated the English armies in Egypt, but the naval battle didn't go so well for him, and he tries to prevent that story from getting back to France. England is going to pose the biggest threat to France during the years of the French Revolution, more so than Prussia and Austria. Because England is an island, and since they're an island, there's no marching your troops over there. And Napoleon is a troops guy, right? He's an army guy. He's not a navy guy. And so Britain, in order to invade Britain with your army, you're going to have to first get through their navy. And Britain knew that. And it had been a long-standing policy of the British to have more ships, a fleet, of ships in their navy larger than the combined fleets of any two other European nations. Now the French Navy during this time is on a pretty good sized par to the British Navy. The French Navy is nothing to sneeze at. They're very, very, very good, and they proved, very crafty adversaries during the French Revolutionary time, but they're just not quite on the same level as the British Royal Navy. And the British Royal Navy at this time in particular had some very clever commanders in charge, And Britain, too, has this whole sense of nationalism, British pride, and so on, that they are fighting to defend. And so very much there's that factor that gets wrapped up into it as well. So anyhow, folks, I am approaching the end of my lecture here. I'm just going to finish up with this slide, the end of the Directory. So basically a conspiracy emerged to save the revolution and prevent a royalist return to power. Emmanuel Joseph Sieyès, who we talked about at the start of the French Revolution, he was the one who gave that speech, "What is the Third Estate?" And in his speech, he said the Third Estate is everything at the Estates General meeting. He's still around by this point. And Emmanuel Joseph Sieyès, who was the leader of this conspiracy, basically invited Napoleon to join the conspirators and overthrow the Directory. And Emmanuel Joseph Sieyès had made a good name for himself going all the way back to the very start of the revolution. He is viewed by many, he was well known during his time as being a true kind of visionary and a true heart, having true, what's the word that I'm looking for, like true sentiment or like honest, genuine sentiment for improving France. And that's why it was pretty easy to him being the leader of this conspiracy, okay, was a really good choice because people trusted Emmanuel Joseph Sieyès. He's a priest, but also beyond that, had always been from the very start on the right side of the revolution, and so on. So he invites Napoleon to join these co-conspirators, overthrow the Directory. Napoleon obliges because he sees this as the best chance of consolidating his own power and bringing France down a path of glory in the name of military strength and political strength and so on. So I will leave our lecture off there, folks. I just want to say thank you so much for tuning in this morning, and I will put up a new assignment for you in a little bit here, so be checking out for that, and we'll see you on Wednesday. Have a great day.